Okay, everyone, we're going to get started today. Welcome to the Director's Talk on the Future of Historic House Museums in the Aftermath of COVID-19. My name is Mary Lesher, and I'm the Programs Manager at Dumbarton House. I will be facilitating our conversation today. Before we get started, I'm going to remind you of a few housekeeping things. The audience will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have questions that you want to submit for the Q&A portion at the end of the conversation, you can use the questions tab that should have popped up when you opened the webinar in your little sidebar. Feel free to use that to submit your questions, and we'll use those at the end. If you're having technical difficulties, you can talk to Veronica. She's available via email, or Rachel, who's available via phone. So if you're having problems listening in, just tap one of them and they can help you out. So, one second, sorry, my slides are advancing too fast. There we go. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists today. First up is Karen Daly. Karen Daly is a museum professional dedicated to preserving our nation's history for future generations. She has led Dumbarton House, the headquarters of the NSCDA, as the executive director since 2008. Before becoming the executive director, Karen served as education director at Dumbarton House and taught 4th grade in the District of Columbia Public Schools. She credits her parents' insistence on history-themed vacation as a child, think Valley Forge, and her incredible undergraduate experience at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, for her passion for preservation. Karen's daily work covers various aspects, including strategic planning, institutional advancement, staff management, and financial oversight. Karen has been awarded the William A. Cochran Award by the Citizens Association of Georgetown, and during her tenure, Dumbarton House was awarded the Communitarian Award by the Georgetown Business Association. Currently, Karen also serves as a board member of the Virginia Association of Museums and the Georgetown Business Association. Next, we have Mark Hudson, who is the executive director of Tudor Place. Mark came to Tudor Place from the Vermont Historical Society, which he directed from 2009 to 2015. During Mark's tenure, the Vermont Historical Society received the 2012 American Association for State and Local Histories Leadership in History Award for the History Explorer website and the publication A Very Fine Appearance, the Vermont Civil War Photographs of George Houghton. Mark directed the Historical Society of Frederick County, Maryland, from 1998 to 2009. During his term there, the Society secured accreditation from the American Association of Museums in 2003 and received the 2005 Small Business Museum Association's Hunter Burley Award for advancing public access and professional growth in an individual institution. Early in his career, Mark was curator of the Boone County Historical Society in Missouri, his home state. Mark's other professional and civic commitments include, since 2010, chairing the Vermont Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission by gubernatorial appointment. He served 6 times as a Museums for America field reviewer for the Institute for Museum and Library Services. His board service includes the Save Historic Antietam Foundation and the Maryland Association of History Museums. And lastly, we have, excuse me, sorry about that, folks. We have Erin Carlson Mast, who is the CEO and Executive Director of President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C. She was a member of the original team leading to the Cottage's grand opening in 2008. Since 2010, Mast has led the organization through growth, groundbreaking programming, and significant recognition, including a presidential medal. During Mast's tenure, the Cottage has been named one of Washington, D.C.'s 50 best places to work and the best museum off the mall for 3 consecutive years. In 2016, she led the organization through its transition to an independent 501c3. Mast has written for such publications as History News and the Public Historian, and was a contributing author to Museums of Ideas, Commitment and Conflict, as well as Mission Matters. She also wrote 2 short biographies of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln. She was recognized with the Excel Chief Executive Leadership Award in 2017 and serves on the board of the American Association for State and Local History. She holds an MA in Museum Studies from the George Washington University and a BA in History from the Ohio University Honors Tutorial College. Okay. So now we're going to stop showing our screen and get into the questions. So we're going to start by having Karen give us some context for this talk. Karen?
Hi, yes, thank you, Mary. And Mary, thank you so much for coordinating us today. I want to also thank my fellow panelists, Erin Carlson Mast and Mark Hudson, for agreeing to join us today. We're excited to be with you all, and as I scan the list of attendees, I realize there's so many good friends on the list and also some new friends, so welcome. And I realize too, and I think all of us on the panel do, that any one of you could easily have conducted a similar conversation today. So we look forward to hearing not only your questions, but maybe also some of your ideas and input when we get to that part of the program later today. We're so really honored that you've joined us today. We here at Dumbarton House are also the national headquarters for the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. And so through our Dames connections, we are connected to an affiliated group of museums across the country, mostly small historic house museums and historic sites, all of whom are struggling now with the plans for reopening, but also I think really thinking critically and maybe with a little bit of excitement about what the future may hold for sites like ours. And so I'm excited to host and join this discussion today to get all of us in the field kind of thinking about what that future for historic house museums is going to look like in this post-COVID-19 world. And glad to have, again, Erin and Mark here to discuss that as well. Mark, do you want to do a quick introduction as well, and then we'll go to Erin before diving in? Oh. Sorry, Mark, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. I would just recommend if you do this again, you might want to get a panelist named Darren so that all the panelist names rhyme. But no, and I just want to say thank you also for being invited to be a part of this. We at Tudor Place have shared in this unusual experience with other museums, and so having this opportunity to come together and talk about really what we see as the outcomes of the pandemic, I think is really important at this moment. And just a few brief comments about Tudor Place. We're located just a few blocks away from our friends at Dumbarton House here in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. We're kind of the new kid on the block. We've been around for a little over 30 years, about 32 years now, as a historic site, and really tell America's story and a way to understand our community through the eyes of the Peter family, who were the residents here for 178 years, so continuous family ownership. So we've really found an opportunity to tell their stories in a new way during the pandemic, and really think about how their lives offer these examples of human resilience and how people get through tough times, and how these difficult situations have a resolution, and we get through tough times. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm so glad to be here with all of you as well. President Lincoln's Cottage is also in Washington, D.C., but we're uniquely on the grounds of the Armed Forces Retirement Home, which is an independent federal agency. So there are over 300 veterans who call this campus home, and so obviously that factored into our decisions about when to close and what our reopening will look like once that eventually happens, because this campus is home to a very vulnerable population of neighbors. I also, while we were in DC, I think that Karen and Mark and I all have affiliations such that we're having regular conversations with sites across the country. And so we're so happy to see so many of you from all around the nation on this call with us. President Lincoln's Cottage is affiliated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And so, we have sister sites all over, on the West Coast, down south, up north, and in the Midwest, who are all experiencing this in some ways that are extremely different and some ways that are very much the same. We've been open to the public for just over a decade. And so we actually opened in 2008, just in time to hit the Great Recession. So we have sort of, our entire time in operation has been in the shadow of that kind of challenge. And Lincoln's time here also reflects that. So we've been able to lean in on the leadership in crisis angle of our storytelling throughout this whole thing. So happy to be here with you all and look forward to getting started on the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all for that brief introduction. So we are going to start today with questions about museum visitation and programming. And the first question is, how are historic house museums particularly well situated to leveraging the lessons of history for the current moment? And Karen, I'll have you tackle that one first.
Sure. Yeah, I think we heard a little bit about this already in our introductory statements, but all of our sites, right, our historic homes have existed through crises, both directly like this one and others over the course of our existence. And so I think we are really, truly uniquely positioned to be able to connect modern day community members and neighbors with the stories that history can offer and the lessons that we can learn from history. Here at Dumbarton House, the house itself dates back to 1799 when Washington was first becoming the capital. And one of the most kind of meaningful historic moments in our house's history was Dolly Madison stopping here during the War of 1812 as the British were approaching the capital. And so if you think about the history that occurred in each of our homes and our sites, and you can, through those stories, I think, really connect visitors today and our public with stories of resilience, of kind of rebirth after crisis. Dumbarton House, once it became a museum, we have been open to the public here in Georgetown for over 85 years now, acquired by the colonial dames back in 1928 to serve as a museum and a national headquarters. And so even during our tenure as a museum, we've lived through crises. During World War II, as an example, the dames actually gave over the museum to the local Red Cross to serve as a location for nursing classes, as well as putting together various supplies and equipment to send abroad. And so again, I think for our communities, we can tell those stories and help give hope that Americans can come out of situations like this and can learn from the past and come out of these stronger. And I think we can also serve as community hubs. I mean, we're very, real kind of historic focal areas in our communities where neighbors are gathering even today, and that can cause, I think, share some comfort with our neighborhoods.
Erin?
Yeah, I would add that, even though the pandemic is something that's happening globally, just as many events that our sites represent historically, like the Civil War, like the Revolutionary War, like World War II, just different global events, at the beginning and end of the day, what's happening can be very different locally. And I think historic sites in particular have that power to put global events or national events in local context and also draw on those local responses. I think, we're also uniquely positioned in that even if we serve an international and national community, every single one of us is part of a local community. And so we can, we're better positioned to listen and understand to what they need. And we provide that authentic place that also gives people that sense of continuity and grounding and identity, which is really important in times of this kind of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that I think has been particularly challenging in this particular crisis is that in past occasions, and I remember particularly after 9/11, the museum was a convening place for people, and we don't have that opportunity to do it right now. So using these the ways that we can communicate with people, particularly just as we're doing right now, sharing these stories is particularly important. And I've through some videos and other networking, have shared some of the stories, for instance, of Britannia Peter Kennan, whose life here at Tudor Place is just sort of jumping from one tragic event to another. Really born in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and died in the years leading up to World War I. But going through the tragic death of her husband, who was killed in an explosion on the Potomac, and rather tragic and challenging events that occurred here during the Civil War and other things like that. And yet she persevered for over 90 years as this matriarch and leader in preservation. And so I think there are these great stories, and the fact that we ourselves are demonstrating the resilience to move beyond the four corners, the four walls of our museums, and find new ways to share these stories is I think proof of the importance of the work that we do.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we're going to go back to Mark, and could you please talk about how you think museum visitorship will change as historic house museums reopen following COVID-19?
Yeah, it's hard to say, and I'm being careful about drawing too many long-term conclusions, but I think we have a limited sampling from some of the museums around the country and across the world who have already reopened. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that people are being very cautious about not just museums, but I think coming into any sort of public space. One of the demographic shifts that we've seen is a move away from, at least for what's our core group, which is families with children and seniors, to young adult couples. Whether that's going to be an enduring trend or not is something that remains to be seen. And this is understandable as well. Sensible people, and I think those who go to museums, I consider them generally to be sensible, will be leery about going into large crowds. And so I think there's a potential advantage for all of us at historic house museums in that the more intimate setting, the smaller environment that we have may be more inviting and may seem to be a more safe space for visitors. And also thinking about with our organization, we have 5.5 acres of gardens and grounds as well. And I think that's something that people definitely are seeing as very safe spaces to visit, so preferable to an indoor experience. So I think it's really up to us as we approach reopening, doing it with caution, but also with some flexibility and sensitivity as well. And I think the really important thing in beginning to reintroduce our audiences is to be really forthright with them about the concerns that we have, and to be really clear about the steps that we're taking to try to ensure that it will be a safe environment.
Erin?
Yeah, I think, in Mark's last point there about transparency, it speaks to, how you approach your interpretation can inform how you're communicating to the public on other things too. And so I think, we've built trust by being honest and about what the interpretation is and how we come to our conclusions on the history. Why not do the same thing in this, in the current context here too? Similar to Mark, I'm reluctant to pretend that I have a crystal ball here and that I know what the long-term effect is going to be on visitation. But I do think this goes back to the point that, this might break down to differences at a local level and differences in what the nature of your historic site is. A battlefield is obviously going to have a very different set of concerns or absence of concerns than, a row house museum that might have virtually no outdoor space. So, one of my colleagues out in California commented that they had no idea when they reopened their landscape if they were going to see dramatically more people, fewer people, or what. And it wound up being tracking very similarly to this exact same time a year ago, but they have extensive grounds, right? And so it's a different equation than it would be for some others. I think that we do have a model that prioritizes small groups already, but even so, for that comfort level, both for the team and the public, and here again, to respect and ensure the safety of our neighbors here, we're going to be a lot more careful about exactly how many people we allow on the grounds at any given time and how we plan that out. We've already started, charting out what that looks like, and focusing on the exterior first is definitely going to be part of what we do, just because it minimizes so many points of potential concern and conflict.
Yeah. We're seeing, so we've been able to keep our grounds open through the shutdown for neighbor use. So we have never ticketed or charged for access to the grounds before, and so So it wasn't a big, thing for us to be able to do, but it's been really well received by our neighbors. And so one thing that we're thinking about in terms of the kind of change to visitation is how do we retain that hyper-local neighborhood connection with those people, some of whom, quite frankly, maybe have lived in the neighborhood for years, but never wandered onto the grounds before or never come through the door for a museum program, and are now very grateful and feeling very connected to us. And we imagine it's a connection that will live on. I mean, think about it. We've got a family who's here every day. We have another family who's teaching their daughter to ride her bike in our parking lot. I mean, those are memories from this time period that will forever connect these neighbors to Dumbarton House. And we want to be able to provide an opportunity for them to stay a part of our visitor model as we move forward. And so that's something we're actively looking at. I think also from a kind of short and midterm perspective, I agree with Mark and Erin, both of you, that I don't have a crystal ball either. I don't know what this is going to mean, for 5 years from now. But in the near term, we're clearly all hearing that travel is going to be hyper-local or regional, right, to begin with, that tourists are not going to be coming back from far-flung areas or from international markets very quickly, or if they are, certainly not in the numbers they once did. And I realize that this is not the same situation in every region of our country, but certainly, I don't know, I think Mark and Erin, you would agree, here in DC, those of us in the small historic house museums don't necessarily get listened to or have a big part to play in like Destination DC's marketing, for tourism to come to Washington, simply because we've got so many large cultural attractions on the mall with the Smithsonian and the monuments, right, and bus tours that are coming through. But in this near term, right, those large bus tours, those huge tourist numbers from abroad and from far-flung areas of the country, they're not coming back. And so I think that they're not going to come back yet. We're right away. I think those of us at these smaller sites, at the historic houses in DC and possibly in your communities around the country as well, have an opportunity to play in marketing our regions for those local and regional tourists who maybe, in our case, right, they've all done the mall already. They've done the National Gallery, but maybe they haven't done Georgetown. Maybe they haven't trekked up to Lincoln's Cottage yet. And we can provide both that safe experience that you all have talked about and something new to attract, these local tourists to our sites. And that might also garner us a seat at the table with the destination marketing folks in a way that maybe we wouldn't have, they couldn't have justified giving us that seat before.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next question is, how should historic house museums adapt their program planning moving forward to account for future pandemics, natural disasters, climate change issues, or economic downturns, and other unprecedented events that we can't even imagine yet? Erin, I'm gonna send that one to you first.
Yeah, I love this question because, I think it's, as people in the history field, we can appreciate that a storm of the century doesn't mean it only happens once every 100 years. And, so it's like, even in the, dozen years the cottage has been open, I think we've had 4 snowfalls of the century. So, like 2 feet, which is such a weird thing in DC. We're not used to that here. So I think, one of the big things here that I think we've heard this word a lot is flexibility and adaptability and being nimble. And I think that applies here as well. And I also think that it's an opportunity for us to rethink some, what we mean by best practices, which creativity and questioning are best practices themselves. So, we know that this is not, going to be the only pandemic that, that it's not the only pandemic that has come around in even the last decade in a way. It's certainly the biggest one, but we've seen other major epidemics that have created issues internationally as well. Same thing with climate change. I think that we need to position both the preservation of our places and our programming, understanding that these things will happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and at this point, how frequently. So I'll give one concrete example of how we did that on the preservation side and on the programming side. On the preservation side, we just did our major capital restoration project in the 2000s, And we were already seeing like severe rot and things happening to a lot of the woodwork on the cottage, despite twice annual, checks on every single feature on the cottage, and a really robust cyclical maintenance plan. So we decided that at this point, we just had to start swapping out. Anytime we did one of these projects, we had to rethink the materials that were going into it and the design. So it might not be 100% accurate to what it was during Lincoln's time, but we're starting to use things like Akoya wood on our exterior, veranda features and things like that. It's sustainable. It's supposed to last a lot longer. It's a lot more expensive up front, but we know we're not going to have to keep replacing it every 7 years, which is essentially what's been happening. We've had record rainy seasons in DC. There was a black mold problem a few years ago that everyone was experiencing. So it's just, a moment to evaluate what you've had to deal with in the long term and make a change in the future that will help you weather that, literally, in the future. On the programming side, we always try to really differentiate what we're doing and be thoughtful about why we're doing it and retain that focus. And going into this, we were actually fairly well prepared. We already had Zoom, we already had distance learning programming, we launched our new podcast last summer. And I think, we didn't create those things for the sake of having something tech or virtual or anything like that. It was really about considering what are the stories we have to tell about who lived at our places, what happened at our places, and what's the audience for that? And then coming up with the best platform to serve those audiences. And the reasoning behind our podcast was we know that there are going to be interruptions to people coming to President Lincoln's Cottage. That was a reality that we first thought of after 9/11, because if we're on a retirement home campus, but it's federal, if they shut down DC, this campus might turn into an active military base. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden we can't operate. So that kind of major interruption to operations has always been in the back of our mind. And we've always tried to plan things that would allow us to shift towards more of a digital programming opportunity. And I think that that's just something that we all need to be doing now, but do it in a way that's distinctive to your organization and the stories that you tell.
Wonderful. Karen?
Yeah, I think I agree completely that, we need to be thinking about what works best for our organizations. And I also think that we have all moved virtual during this pandemic, and I think that virtual is here to stay. So to Erin's point, yes, I think all of us, regardless of whether we're on a federal site or just in a neighborhood, right, like Dumbarton House, need to be prepared for the possibility of closure moving forward for any number of reasons. And you're right, we have all closed for various reasons, over the years. I think when the Pope came to DC, we had to close because of all the security restrictions and road closures, even here in Georgetown. So I think that what this has allowed us the opportunity to do is even if we hadn't already begun to build virtual programs, we have been forced to, and that will live on forever. I think also, quite frankly, what was even more impactful for us, certainly, but maybe for many of us, I think we have a large constituency as the headquarters for the National Society of Colonial Dames of stakeholders who are around the country. They're not hyper local. Also, they tend to skew older, and I don't think that that's unusual amongst Historic House Museum visitation. Our visitors and our donors and our members generally skew older. So this is not necessarily a demographic that embraced technology and virtual programming before, but guess what? Like, that audience pool is now totally comfortable with Zoom, and they can join a video conference, and they're interested in connecting with interesting programming across the country, even if they can't, be there in person. And so I think that we have been able to get over that hump in terms of our stakeholders and potential audience group being comfortable with the technology far faster than, I think it saved us a decade, quite frankly. Yeah. Seriously.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And that that for us means virtual is here to stay. I mean, we've gotten really good response to some of our programming. You know, Mary has run really wonderful small workshops, you know, where she's conducting a demonstration and people are at home using their supplies to cross stitch with her. We've also had the more traditional kind of scholarly presentation webinars, and there is a market for that, and I think that market will continue after this situation ends. So for us, in terms of the adaptation of planning, yes, I think a lot of our on-site programs will be altered, at least in the near term, because of all of the concerns about safety and distance and so forth. But I think the real long-term impact for us is going to be on that virtual programming opportunity, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I've thought about this question too, more not so much in the realm of programming, but just whole institutional planning. And I think one of the things that's critical for us at this moment is to document what we've done. We did so many things, particularly in those first 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic, completely in a reactive mode, and just I've just got to get through today, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. And I don't think we've taken enough time to reflect or document what's happened. And so I think we should, at some intervals in here, think about how those decisions were made, decide, evaluate whether they were effective or not. And I think from there we can figure out what of these things are going to be enduring. And along with what you were saying, Karen, that our audience has adapted to this new technology, we have ourselves, and some of it, for me, some of it's been rather joyful. I've always wanted to develop better skills in video editing, and being the only person on site here, I've been asked by staff, can you do a video of this and a video of that? And I look at the quality of the things that I did 6 weeks ago and what I can do now, and they're quite different. And for our organization, we've placed a lot of emphasis in the last 18 months in emergency planning, both in developing plans, but also drilling staff and things like that. And we recognized that one of the deficiencies that we had was our contingency planning for alternative work environments. We had worked out, because we've got really three functional spaces here, 3 different buildings. We have figured out ways, for different reasons, to move people to different buildings. And I kept thinking, well, whatever the event would be where we couldn't use any 3 of the buildings, we'll be foraging for food at that point. So, but I think I have to admit, I mean, this was not something that we had really fully worked into our planning. And so obviously, as we go forward with our emergency planning, this is something that we're going to have to think about. And so I think that's the importance of documenting what we have done and the decisions that have been made.
And Mark, I think that brings up a really good point as well, that goes beyond kind of program planning, but the whole telework aspect of this pandemic. I mean, I know from my perspective, I had been open to the idea of telework and remote work for our staff before, and we had some flexibility and some pilot testing of that here. But I'm much more willing to support broader scale, long-term telework for staff positions after this experience. I think we've been able to show that we can make it work, both in the sense of the staff members themselves working from home, and in terms of our IT, infrastructure to be able to allow that. So that's another, I think, lasting change that, to your point, as we come out of this and we reflect, I see that as forever changing, probably not just for historic house museums. I think that's going to be something we'll see, across the workspace, right? Of the economy.
And I think there's 2 parts to that. One is the sort of policy side of it, figuring out where this fits in within your overall operational scheme as an organization, but then there's the technical part of it as well. So making sure that people can work successfully at home or in whatever alternative work environment they have.
And a point on that is that, we say we don't have crystal balls, but just last year we adopted brand new telework and alternative work schedule policies at the cottage. So from a policy perspective, we were ready to go, and we were already using Dropbox and Slack and all those tools. But until you're in the moment, and 2 weeks is a lot different than several months. One of the things that we really value, we're place-based organizations. Being here definitely helps our work, and also cultural organizations, and that includes staff culture. And so we've constantly had to reevaluate how do we retain and maintain our staff culture with telework, because it's going to look a little different. We don't have those serendipitous opportunities to run into each other in the hallway or on the ground somewhere. So it is both a policy thing, and I would add that we need to be mindful of culture, and that goes back to being the reflective piece too. These are places of reflection on history. We talk, we love people who historically kept diaries or logged what their decisions were. Let's make sure that we're doing that ourselves. I love that, Mark. I think that's a great point.
Yeah. I think I hear a white paper like ASLH History News submission in the works.
Yeah. One other thing I would add is just as we're doing this today, within a couple days of us closing to the public, our talented programming team came up with brand new virtual programs, including one that we've continued weekly, which is a virtual family game night with a partner. And so, that's another thing. We really leaned on partners during this. And they're all about problem solving and different things that tie back in some way to the history here. But I've also been amazed at how programs that we're offering the general public, like things on empathy and crisis leadership or finding common humanity, draw a huge number of participants from our field too. So we did a common humanity workshop, and I think 30% of the attendees were from the museum field, even though that was not the target audience for that program. So I think it's, the audience is sort of like your immediate stakeholders, the field, and then your communities and general public.
Been a robust discussion, but I am going to move us along on our question list. We're going to move towards funding. It is predicted that many house museums will not survive the pandemic. How can small institutions like house museums create more sustainable business models and revenue streams to protect themselves from future economic downturns? And I'm going to put this question to Erin first, since Lincoln's Cottage opened right on the eve of the Great Recession.
Yeah. So I think the short answer to this is to diversify, and I truly mean that in every way possible. You don't want everything to rely on one major event or one major, product that you have, or one major program offering. And your contribution stream needs to be diversified as well. It's not just the earned income side, and to partner. And that might sound like a funny one, because we uncoupled ourselves from another 501c3 a few years ago, so that would seem like unpartnering, and yet we still have a agreement with them to continue some sort of affiliation and partnership. And as I just mentioned, what we found is that during this time, we've really relied on some of our partners to streamline things. And I even remember what we were seeing in 2008. You started hearing a lot of conversations around organizations separating and organizations joining forces. And I'm actually surprised we haven't been hearing more of those kinds of conversations now about smaller organizations in particular, consolidating. We definitely learned the lessons of 2008. We're the only national monument in the entire country that doesn't receive federal operating support. It was designed that way in the early 2000s when we initiated the project. And we are one of the only presidential sites I know of that has no endowment. So when I became the executive director in 2010, a couple years after we opened, we had an advisory board at the time. It wasn't a board of directors, but I got together with the treasurer of the advisory board, if you will. It was kind of like a shadow board. And we talked about trying to build up a cash reserve. And then as we approached this idea of becoming an independent organization, I commissioned a feasibility study to look at all of our finances and what the in-kind value was of being part of a parent organization like the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and wound up using that as a fundraising tool as well. So going into the pandemic, we had a year of operating support in cash, unrestricted. We did not build that up in one day. That was, there were parts of campaigns that fed into that. There were budgeted surpluses that fed into that. It was a lot of careful financial management, careful planning, and not assuming that the good times were always going to roll once we recovered from that 08 recession. So, you know, there's been a lot of information from the American Alliance Museums of how many museums were, you know, in the red at the end of last fiscal year, how many of them have 3 months or less of operating. So I know that there is you know, it's easy to tell someone to build up a cash reserve, but we're in the moment now. So, you know, all the guidance I'm seeing at this point is to remember that cash is king, which it really is in these circumstances, and to advocate, and keep up your communication with your fundraisers or with your funders. So, you know, I think the diversification and partnership are two of the big things, and then the advocacy and communication with your funders is the other one.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that idea of diversification is really key, and not just diversifying in your, you know, one of the lessons for us has to do with temporal diversification. Yeah. In the months of April and May, we have our biggest public program, which has a revenue stream associated with it. Those are our two busiest months as far as visitation generally. And we have our spring fundraiser that was supposed to be this past Wednesday. And so maybe just distributing your revenue lines throughout the year might be a useful way to do that. One of the lessons that I learned in you know, the Great Recession, and I think to some degree also after 9/11 as a museum director, was to respond quickly. You know, the tendency is let's wait and see how bad this is going to get. One of the things we did take action right away, recognizing that our normal revenue streams were going to be severely disrupted, and we didn't know what kind of help was going to come through things like the CARE Act and other things. And so we did two things. One was to try to control costs in any way that we could. We did do some reductions in hours and staffing that we've since been able to restore because of the PPP program. But also one of the things that I'm very proud of, our board leadership, our executive committee, and particularly our board president, stepped up immediately and said, I'm going to get on the phone and I'm going to call 7 people and I'm going to explain the situation to them. And we had some great results from that. So some revenue that we didn't know was going to came in really at the right moment. And I want to just echo too what Erin said about cash reserves. And it's I wish I could say that we had a year of cash reserves. We don't.
We did.
But I think you can look at some of the opportunities as well. So it may not always be a case where you can generate more revenue than you're spending, but when you do have a windfall, for instance, a bequest or some other kind of windfall, you might think about, rather than creating a project to spend that money, put that aside as part of your cash reserve. You know, that's really critical. So yeah, diversification, quick action, and having some cash on hand.
Yeah. I'll say ditto to all of that, Mary, so we can continue on. But yeah, diversification. Yes.
I appreciate that brief answer, Karen. We're going to move into staffing questions. So let's go with, what would you say to students or recent graduates who are going into or interested in museum work? And Karen, we'll go to you first on that one.
Sure. So I think I think one, we need you. I think this crisis has certainly shown that we can all benefit from the creativity of our kind of newer colleagues, newer to the field colleagues. Their tech know-how is certainly well received right now. So we absolutely need you. We need your passion and creativity and enthusiasm for the field. I think I would also, and I do, whenever I'm speaking with students or those considering the field for a career, I would encourage them to be both realistic and flexible. This is a field with significant supply of prospective employees without sufficient equivalent demand in terms of high-paying museum positions that are open and available for those interested parties. So you have to be realistic about that and understand the supply and demand, components of the economic situation. And I think it's important to be flexible and to remember that you can contribute to the field in a variety of ways. And so many people we know going into the field are passionate about collections or education, right? I mean, those of us, I'm sure Mark, Erin, we post for collections or an education position and we get hundreds of incredibly qualified candidates, right? Everybody wants to work with the collections or teach the people about the collections. The reality is that you can be just as important and valuable a member of the team and contribute to the organization's mission by helping us to raise money, as a development staff member, by being on the finance and business side and administration side of the work. You can also contribute just as much to the field sometimes as a volunteer or as a board member or a donor. And so we certainly have a network of folks who are involved with Dumbarton House who maybe interned with us at one point and now work in a totally different sector, right? But have continued to volunteer or continued to contribute as a museum member. And we all serve on boards, right? So there are opportunities to contribute to the field, even in kind of non-staff position ways. And I don't think we should, as folks entering the profession, should necessarily rule those out entirely.
Mark or Erin, do you have any brief remarks on that?
No, I would agree. Yeah, just that message of patience and flexibility are important. And we don't know what effect the pandemic is going to have on the overall job market. It may be that we weather this fine, but I think if there is a constriction, that's going to make it even more challenging and require even greater flexibility.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think also echoes what we saw in 2008 and to a smaller extent what we saw in 2003, which was sort of a mini dip. And I don't want, this will sound a little sobering, but most of the people I graduated with that were, my close friends in museum studies have left the field, but that doesn't mean that they're not still involved. They might work for another company, but they still, donate and spend a lot of time at museums. And then the other thing that we also need to consider is what a disaster it would be if we lost like an entire generation of people from the history or museum field. Because, in economic downturns like this, you might have people who are considering retirement holding off. And then that creates, everyone has a right to make their personal decisions, but that creates that backup that we saw in 2008, where to Karen's point, a lot of those jobs weren't opening up. So people weren't moving up, and then those entry-level positions weren't materializing in the way that they had been sort of in a more steady way or cyclical way in the years before. So I totally agree with everything Karen and Mark said here, but please don't be disheartened. And if it is what you're passionate about, there are plenty of ways to get involved.
Great. So we had a section on advocacy, relevance, and value planned, but we have 10 minutes left, so we're going to jump straight into the Q&A. Luckily, we have a question that does speak to our advocacy and relevance topic. It's from Elizabeth Towers, who wanted all of you to speak more about the idea of building trust. And we've taught one of our questions that we were going to ask with that, according to IMLS, or a few different studies actually, says that the public places more trust in museums than in other sources like government agencies or newspapers. So could you guys talk more about trust, and does that refer to building trust in the interpretation of your house? And to use the examples of if slaves lived in the home, if you address a racial component in your interpretation, or if that trust is maybe more of a social interaction or trust with your staff. Could you guys speak to that a little bit?
I can start with this. There has been so much written over the years about how much trust people place in museums and history museums in particular. I have a theory that I haven't, it's just a theory, that a lot of that's because the public doesn't realize how much interpretation goes into it, and that you might have, and I would wager that this is true at a lot of historic sites, you can't have a situation where there's tremendous trust in us, but there's also a book that gets published like Lies Across America, and not wonder if maybe there's some, confirmation bias happening, or if it's because some institutions are repeating the stories that, a community holds near and dear, but might not be, based in sort of a complex and rigorous analysis of the past. So my short answer to this is that trust is both about trust in the organization and trust in the interpretation. We really need to practice what we preach, and our credibility as an organization has to be internal and external. And so sometimes I'll talk about this in terms of living your mission and vision. You know, we have the idea of truth telling baked into our mission. And so we better be doing it on the operational side as well if we want to have that credibility. So it means, yes, confronting some of the more you know, complex and nuanced parts of the stories that are embodied in our places, and being very transparent about how we are coming to those conclusions, and also how we are attempting to sort of live the other side of that in our organizations as well. So, you know, a few years ago, we did a crowdfunding campaign to replace the cocoa matting in the cottage with, you know, it was what we'd put in there during the restoration. It had worn out, it needed to be replaced. When we did the restoration in the aughts, we weren't really thinking of modern day slavery and unfair labor practices in the rug making industry. We used that crowdfunding campaign as a way to say, this is something that we're aware of, we want to spread more awareness, and you know what, we're prioritizing fair and safe labor practices over 100% historical accuracy, and that's the best decision for us as an organization. So it's something that feeds into each other, both your interpretation, how you do your work, and how you talk about your work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it transcends the interpretation, and it's how we behave as, you know, both as individuals, but as an institution as well. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us at this moment to build public trust by the way that we have behaved in this event, and taking the safety of our visitors and our staff seriously. And I think we have an opportunity as we reopen to be to really reinforce the reasons why the public trusts us in the way that they do. And so this idea of being as transparent as possible about what our intentions are, what our plans are, and how we're going to carry forward, I think is going to do a great deal to reinforce that idea of trust.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So now we have a series of questions that are about virtual programming compared to in-person programming. How do you guys see the balance between virtual and in-person working for small institutions? And what are your thoughts on monetizing that kind of programming moving forward?
I think here there's a lot of opportunity, to one of Erin's points earlier, to benefit from partnerships. I think some of us will develop, or some of us came into the pandemic with a national audience of sorts already, and so we can leverage and build that during this period with virtual programming that can potentially continue as we move forward. I think we can also look to partner in ways like this program as an example, to reach a broader audience online than perhaps any one of our sites would have been able to reach on our own. And I think we have opportunities in some cases to leverage those with other partners as well. So I'm thinking, for example, here, you know, with Dumbarton House as the headquarters for the Dames, we could partner with one of our other Great American Treasures Dames museum properties, let's say, you know, the Hawaii mission houses, you know, in Hawaii, which might have a wonderful program that they typically offer on site. And maybe there's a way that we could partner and co-present a program that then, because they're linked with us and we have this national connection through the Dames across the country, could reach a national audience and help benefit the mission houses as well as help benefit Dumbarton House. And so I think that there are opportunities for that that can be helpful for small museums. I think it's going to be a challenge in terms of balancing the workload, and particularly because I think in this near term we're probably going to be working on a hybrid model where we're going to be forced, you know, to do both some on-site programming as we reopen and some virtual programming, because even once we're fully reopened, like full capacity, vaccine and all of that, there is still going to be a population that's not going to choose to re-engage personally for a while. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, in terms of the workload in this near term as we're trying out these hybrid models. But I do think that we can monetize it. I think I think we often undervalue ourselves and our programs, and I think we want to be generous and offer everything for free, and there is a place for that. But there's also a great deal of market research and study about, you know, placing the right price on your programs, and that will, in some cases, you know, help the market better value what you're offering. So I think, yes, we should be looking at monetizing, and we've had some success with that during the pandemic that we'll continue exploring.
I think that's another place where we can do a lot of experimentation too, and we've sort of danced around that word, but we're all doing it. And you know, we have with our online programming, we've been experimenting with suggested donations, you know, and fee-based programming less so, especially early on if we were making the case that this is something people need because they're hurting, and so many other people were offering things for free. You know, if the competitive market is all free, you're gonna have a harder time charging for it. But then the other thing that we've had a little bit of success with is pay it forward. Now, every single one of those might work better with a different audience. So pay it forward works better when we're talking about, like, you know, a kit for distance learning versus like attending a scholarly session online. But we have been playing with all three of those, and I think we need to continue to do that experimentation, and that will continue, because as things settle out, to Karen's point, you know, what worked in the total closure of the pandemic might not work the same once we've reopened.
Yeah, and I think there's an important moment coming up in the next few months as we're making that transition back onto our sites, and I think there are going to be some decision points that we'll need to make. Maybe there are programs that we've been doing in a virtual way that we really should continue like that. So I think there will be some enduring. And as to whether we should monetize it, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah,
I see that Mary asked, help, what is pay it forward? So Mary, that's basically giving people the opportunity to purchase it for someone else. And so that's where we saw that really coming into a play when we had these home learning kit things where you could, you know, buy one for yourself, but you could also pay for one for another family. And then we worked with our educator network to pair those donations up, but it's a donation specifically for someone else. So that's what pay it forward is in this context.
Like when you cover the toll booth, you know,
that's
for
right.
the person in the car behind you. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we just have about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to have one more question. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. They were wonderful. The last question that I'm going to put to you guys comes from Sarah Coster, and she was intrigued by Karen's discussion about hyper-local tourism and connected that to the swell of support that we're seeing for small businesses and local restaurants right now. And she wants to know how museums can tap into that network and maybe drive that hyper-local tourism even more.
Yeah, one thing before I dive in, hi Sarah, glad you're with us. But I think we might try to be able to respond to some of the questions that came in, perhaps by email or afterward, and Mary, we can coordinate so that if you did put a question in that we didn't get to, we can make sure to respond to you. But Sarah, I think that's a really great point, and yeah, I think that's another opportunity for partnership. I know something that we've started to think about, but haven't really fully activated yet is whether we could play a role. And Mark, we should get together and talk about this in terms of Georgetown. But if we could partner with the local restaurants or retail in some way, as they start to reopen, you know, or are already in some cases, you're right, Sarah, having, you know, significant local support in the form of the pickup and curbside dining and so forth. So yes, I think there's opportunity there. We haven't fully fleshed out what that might look like for us.
Yeah, I think there's opportunities for partnership, and I think just in philanthropy as well. And I think people understand the circumstances that we're facing, and you know, I've seen it certainly in our experience that people want to help, and they just want to know what's the best way to help.
Yeah, I think it's also worth reflecting on what those entities, restaurants, you know, local businesses were doing that laid the foundation for that kind of support in the first place. Like, why are people, you know, I mean, there's obviously a very strong emotional connection. And if you feel like that same thing is not transferring to the organization, maybe reflect on why that might be. You know, I mean, part of it could be that you are that place of great meaning, but that people think of museums as forever places that don't need help, whereas we know restaurants struggle to survive even in the best of times. But I think one of the things that that I did that was as much a way of sort of, it was like a love letter to our immediate local community. There's a local blog that I wrote a guest piece for, and it was really heartwarming to be able to look back and think of the joint fundraisers that we've done. There's a local bar that will, their bartenders will do our annual preservation fundraiser event. And I was thinking about like the couples from the neighborhood that have gotten married here, and they had Timber Pizza do the catering. And so to sort of go through all these local connections to the immediate community, yes, we're a national monument, we get visitors from all over the world, but it was nice to be able to sort of write this love letter to the community about how much we miss them, and to sort of reflect on all the amazing times we've had together and the partnerships we've had and the connections we've made, and just remind them that we look forward to doing that again at some point in the future when it's safe to do so. So some of it might just be as simple as communicating how much you miss your community and how much you look forward to welcoming them back.
Thank you for such a wonderful discussion. All three of our panelists, you brought so much knowledge to this, and we appreciate your time and energy in participating. Thank you for all of you who joined us virtually. We're so glad that you were here, and we hope you're all safe and well in your respective homes. And thank you for joining us today. Everybody have a good afternoon and a good weekend.
Thank you. Be safe, be well.
Bye, everybody.